Hey everyone, it's me, Mike. Welcome back to Moby Dick Explained. It's 1 billion degrees, and I'm gonna try to record this in between little bursts of AC. This time around, we covered 3 chapters. Chapter 14, Nantucket, Chapter 15, Chowder, and Chapter 16, the ship. Chapter 16, the ship. 14, 15, 16? 14, 15, 16. Chapter 14, Nantucket. Chapter 15, Chowder. Chapter 16, the ship. This one's a little bit weird because 2 of these chapters are very short and pretty straightforward. And then one of the chapters, chapter 16, is a little bit longer and more serious. And it's actually kind of a lot more important for what we're here to do. So I'll cover the basics from those first 2, and then we'll be spending most of our time talking about chapter 16, the ship. Let's get going. Chapter 14, Nantucket. Chapter 14 sees our pals Ishmael and Pequod finally landing in Nantucket, which is the place from which they're going to set out on this whaling adventure. This chapter is almost entirely dedicated to describing the island of Nantucket, which we know from previous videos is at this point the whaling capital of the world. But it's not a very hospitable place. Ishmael talks about how basically nothing grows on this island and the entire island is sort of centered on the sea. That bits of pieces of wood in Nantucket are carried about like bits of the true cross in Rome. That people there plant toadstools before their houses to get under the shade in the summertime. That one blade of grass makes an oasis. The major thing that Ishmael wants us to understand about Nantucket is that this is a place that takes its living from the sea and can't get it from anywhere else. But he's also very specific about what it means to take your living from the sea. Merchant ships are but extension bridges, armed ones but floating forts. Even pirates and privateers, though following the sea as highwaymen, the road, they but plunder other ships, other fragments of the land, like themselves, without seeking to draw their living from the bottomless deep itself. What Ishmael is saying here is, yeah, other people work on the ocean. There are cargo ships and merchant ships and military ships and passenger ships, tons of ships. But these people aren't really living with the ocean. All of these ships are just man-made islands. They're little pieces of land that go from land to land and do the business of land. Nantucketers, by contrast, live with the sea. They take their living from the sea. The Nantucketer, he alone resides and riots on the sea. He alone, in Bible language, goes down to it in ships, to and fro plowing it as his own special plantation. To Ishmael, the fishermen and whalemen of Nantucket are unique in that they don't just patrol the ocean or work on the ocean, they reach down into it and they pull their living from under its surface. And that's a big reason why Ishmael has chosen to start his journey in this symbolic, important place. Let's keep going. Chapter 15, Chowder. Chapter 15 is one of these weird chapters in Moby Dick that almost doesn't need an analysis. Pequod and Ishmael hop off the ferry and they set about finding a bed and breakfast that was recommended to them by Peter Coffin, the innkeeper of the Spouter Inn. Coffin has told them his cousin has a place in Nantucket and it's one of the best places to stay, the absolute best places to stay, and that it has world famous Michelin star chowder, which of course is exactly what he's going to say about the place his cousin owns. His cousin probably says the exact same thing about the Spouter Inn when people land in Nantucket, and we've all seen what a nice place the Spouter Inn is. A couple of things just to note in this chapter. First, Ishmael sees another grim omen in the sign of the tripods, which is the bed and breakfast. The sign is hung from the cross trees of an old ship. Cross trees are the horizontal bits of wood that are on a sailing ship that all the sailing stuff's attached to. I don't know, I'm not a sailor, but they're horizontal wood. Anyway, to Ishmael, the sign resembles a gallows, which, if you're keeping score, is like the 9,000th bad omen, the thousandth, not 9 millionth bad omen. And Ishmael is aware of this. A coffin my innkeeper upon landing in my first whaling port. Tombstones staring at me in the whaleman's chapter. And here, a gallows. It's a bad omen. It's a bad omen. That's pretty much the only important thing in the chapter worth diving into. Although there's a series of kind of weird bits with Ishmael, who seems like he might be feeling himself after the ferry ride with Queequeg. He does like a weird bit about the chowder where the bed and breakfast lady asks him if he wants clam or I think salmon, and he does this whole bit where he's like, one clam? How could we eat one clam? He's just like really being a dork, basically. I'm not going to really lay it out in this video, but the funniest part of it to me is that while he's doing this sort of stupid bit, Queequeg and the bed and breakfast lady are just flat out ignoring him. They don't respond at all to his really stupid joke. But I guess it does speak to him kind of loosening up a little bit. Like he's got a cool friend now. He's one step closer to his journey. So maybe we could think of it as important in that context. But anyways, he's just being stupid, basically. And I think it's funny. Anyway, let's move on to the real meat of this conversation, which is chapter 16. Chapter 16, the ship. Okay, now we're getting down to business. In the morning, Ishmael goes out to find the ship that he and Queequeg are going to sign on to as whalemen. He does this alone because Queequeg tells him that his god, Yojo, has decided that Ishmael should choose the ship. Yojo earnestly enjoined that the selection of the ship should rest wholly with me, inasmuch as Yojo purposed befriending us, and in order to do so, had already pitched upon a vessel, which, if left to myself, I, Ishmael, should infallibly light upon, for all the world as though it had turned out by chance. So not as much choosing the ship as Yojo, Queequeg's god, has decided the ship's already there. And if Ishmael kind of goes out on his own, he'll find it naturally. It'll feel like a choice, but it's meant to be. Ishmael does not like this plan. He's never been whaling. He doesn't know what to look for. And he's kind of been counting on Queequeg as the expert to carry him through the next parts of this journey. He met Queequeg. He got really excited that he made a whaling friend. And he's thinking, oh, this guy who knows what he's doing is going to be my guide through this thing. So for Queequeg to tell him, no, actually, my God says you're going to find it, is not news that Ishmael really wants to hear. Queequeg's not willing to debate this thing. And in fact, he locks himself into a room and starts what Ishmael calls a Lent or a Ramadan. And we'll read more about that in the next video. Reluctantly, Ishmael kind of accepts that he's not going to win this one, goes out to find the ship. There are 3 whaling ships currently in port in Nantucket, preparing for their next voyage. Ishmael checks out a couple, but he immediately gravitates towards a ship called the Pequod. The Pequod is special, and it stands out to Ishmael as special. It's battered and old. It's been all over the world. It's clearly a seasoned, tough old ship that's been through it, and it's been repaired, and pieces of it have been replaced, and it's like this weird ship of Theseus amalgamation of old ship and new ship, and it's just got this very stark, I want to say iconic look to it. And it's completely covered and accented with whalebone. I'll read you the description because it's important to get this thing clear in our heads. She was a thing of trophies, a cannibal of a craft, tricking herself forth in the chaste bones of her enemies. All round, her unpaneled open bulwarks were garnished like one continuous jaw with the long, sharp teeth of the sperm whale, inserted there for pins to fasten her old hempen thews and tendons to. Those thews ran not through the base blocks of land wood, but deftly traveled over sheaves of sea ivory. Whalebone. Scorning a turnstile wheel at her reverend helm, she sported there a tiller, and that tiller was in one mass curiously carved from the long, narrow jaw of her hereditary foe. In some ways, Ishmael's description of the Pequod makes it seem like it's a monster in of itself. And it's this combination of the ship obviously having been on many journeys, being kind of patchwork, but replaced and not replaced, and weathered but fixed, and also wearing the bones of all of its successful hunts in this sort of, horrifying, iconic, singular appearance. All those things are what draw Ishmael towards it and make him feel like this is the one. Ishmael decides this is the ship. He hops on the deck. He starts looking for the captain. Instead, he encounters two men, Peleg and Bildad, who are themselves old whalemen, but now co-owners and co-investors of the Pequod. For the people of Nantucket, whaling is such a huge part of their world that they invest in whaling ships the same way we invest in stocks or savings accounts. And one ship, like the Pequod, can be owned in many small parts by a bunch of people who split the proceeds of whatever comes back. It makes sense that whalemen and whaling captains, upon retiring, would kind of turn to investing in other whale ships because it would provide them with a steady stream of income, and it's also their expertise. Peleg and Bildad are a very funny pairing. Peleg is kind of this gruff, salty, man of the sea, sailing stereotype. And he kind of gives Ishmael a hard time about his ocean credentials and also like why he wants to go out whaling. But flukes, man, what makes thee want to go a whaling, eh? It looks a little suspicious, don't it? Hast not been a pirate, hast thou? Didst not rob thy last captain, didst thou? Dost not think of murdering the officers when thou gettest to sea? He also tries to intimidate Ishmael a little bit by telling us about the Pequod's captain, a man named Ahab. Even if this is your first time reading Moby Dick, you've probably heard this name before. I have definitely mentioned Ahab in this series, but he's also one of the most famous characters in all English literature. But this is our first time in the book hearing directly about Ahab. And the story is not encouraging. We learn first that Ahab only has one leg because the other one was chomped off by a whale. Lost by a whale. Young man, come nearer to me. It was devoured. Chewed up, crunched by the monstrousest parmacetti that ever chipped a boat. It's worth noting that Peleg makes an effort to let us know the leg wasn't just chomped by a whale. It was chomped by a specific whale. By the meanest, scariest whale ever. And with that, we're starting to get into the real Moby Dick. Even so, we're still not going to meet Ahab for a while. Instead, we'll talk next to Bildad, who is like the opposite of Peleg. He's a calm, well-spoken, hyper-religious Quaker, and he seems almost immune to the sort of rough lunacy we see kind of coming out of Peleg. But he too is a successful, experienced whaleman, though refusing from conscientious scruples to bear arms against land invaders, yet himself had illimitably invaded the Atlantic and Pacific, and though a sworn foe to human bloodshed, yet had he in his straight-bodied coat spilled tons upon tons of Leviathan gore. How now in the contemplative evening of his days the pious Bildad reconciled these things in the reminiscence, I do not know. But it did not seem to concern him much, and very probably he had long since come to the sage and sensible conclusion that a man's religion is one thing, and this practical world quite another. That is an interesting thought at the end of this passage, that a man's religion is one thing, and the real world another. It echoes a bit about what we talked about before of the difficulties of obeying God, the difficulties of setting your own desires aside, the frustration or the dissonance or the conflict that can occur when what we know about God and what God wants from us based on our religion sort of collides with the grim reality of making a living in the world or existing in the world or dealing with life. And it lays bare a very stark truth, which is call it religion or call it morals or call it whatever you want to call it. a lot of that stuff's only good so far. And then when it collides with what it takes to survive, how useful is it? How much can you hold on to it? How much can you stay true to the things you believe and care about, even deeply, when you're faced with trying to live? There's no answer to that question, or at least there's no broad answer to that question. It's kind of each person's to decide. But it is something that we all deal with every single day, which is the limits of our morals and beliefs in comparison to the challenges and shortcomings of real life. Sometimes, like Bildad, presumably, we have to compromise. Another thing about Bildad that's interesting, he's not as brash as Peleg. He's not as like loud and stompy and as much of a scene as Peleg is. But he's still known to be a very harsh, exacting, methodical whaleman. For a pious man, especially for a Quaker, he was certainly rather hard-hearted, to say the least. He never used to swear, though, at his men, they said, but somehow he got an inordinate quantity of cruel, unmitigated hard work out of them. When Bildad was a chief mate, to have his drab-colored eye intently looking at you made you feel completely nervous, till you could clutch something, a hammer or a marling spike, and go to work like mad at something or other, never mind what. Indolence and idleness perished before him. It kind of gives us another little clue as to what it takes to succeed in this endeavor. Even as a pious man, you have to be incredibly hard. Peleg and Bildad, both uniquely qualified in their own way and their own expertise, are seeing about the business of preparing the Pequod for its whaling journey. Ishmael explains to us that because these whaling voyages require such long absences, many captains don't see about the ship when the ship is in port, instead choosing to spend that time with their family because they're gone for years at a time. So Ishmael, like most of the other people on this voyage, signs on and does his pay negotiation with Bildad and Peleg. He doesn't meet Captain Ahab, and he won't for a while. There's some back and forth here about the way whalemen are paid, and Bildad and Peleg do what seems like a pretty practiced good cop, bad cop negotiating thing that Ishmael totally falls for. But either way, he signs on with the Pequod. But even though it's pretty normal for Ahab to not be there prepping the ship, Ishmael is still really curious about him, just as you would be. And he does ask about him and ask whether there's a chance to maybe introduce himself. Peleg tells him kind of ominously, you're not going to get to meet him because there's something wrong with him. There's some kind of sick or something, and he's shut up in his house, and he won't meet anyone, and he won't talk to anyone. But Peleg wants Ishmael to understand, despite this maybe weirdness, Ahab is quite a captain. I'm going to read the whole description the same way I did with the ship, because it's really important that we kind of get this guy in our minds. He's a queer man, Captain Ahab, so some think, but a good one. Oh, thou like him well enough. No fear, no fear. He's a grand, ungodly, godlike man. Doesn't speak much, but when he does speak, then you may well listen. Mark ye, be forewarned. Ahab's above the common. Ahab's been in colleges as well as among the cannibals, been used to deeper wonders than the waves, fixed his fiery lance in mightier, stranger foes than whales. An incredible description of this guy, an incredible description. And that one sentence, a grand, ungodly, godlike man, does so much to communicate to us the idea of Ahab. Larger than life, bigger than human, godlike, ungodly, not like God, potentially dangerous, villainous, evil? It's a description that says this guy's almost beyond describing. It also kind of forewarns us that this guy's not just going to be like a stereotypical captain we've seen in a pirate movie. He's something else. Also, it establishes that Ahab is not a person we want to mess with. He's intelligent, he's capable, he's cunning. smart. That matters. That's going to matter a lot. And we'll see in the way he speaks, he's not a dumb guy. But most importantly, he's a good captain. And that's what matters to Peleg. That's the most important thing he wants to communicate to Ishmael. This guy's a good captain, despite whatever else you may hear or see. He's a good captain. It's better to sail with a moody good captain than a laughing bad one. Think about it. When your life is on the line, when everything's going wrong, when the storm is upon you and the whale is smashing the side of the boat and everything is as bad as it can be, do you want to be with the friendly, cool captain who's kind of a bumbling fool? Or do you want to be with the captain who's kind of a jerk, but really knows what he's doing? Which would you prefer when your life is on the line? The moody, good captain or the affable, bad one? Of course, it's not a binary choice, right? And it's a dangerous idea. The idea that the genius or the really competent person can be a jerk or should be a jerk or even has to be a jerk. There's a toxic idea in there we have to be really careful of, which is justifying bad behavior from people who are really talented. And it's not just in this book, it's an idea that we see in our real lives all the time. The idea of the tortured artist who treats everybody poorly. It doesn't have to be that way. People can be competent, geniuses, really good at what they do, and nice. But in this case, the point that Peleg is making is that if you have to choose the competent jerk or the friendly dummy, you probably choose the competent jerk. That doesn't mean that all people who are competent should be jerks or need to be jerks. I don't like that idea. I want to really clarify that I don't think those things are mutually exclusive. But in this example, we get what Peleg's saying. Ahab's a good captain. He's a good guy. You can trust yourself with him. You can trust signing on the ship. This guy's going to get you where you need to go, and everything's going to be okay. Ishmael sort of accepts that explanation, but he does feel probably the same way that we feel, which is really, really curious about Ahab and really anxious to meet him. And yet I also felt a strange awe of him. But that sort of awe, which I cannot at all describe, was not exactly awe. I do not know what it was, but I felt it, and it did not disincline me towards him, though I felt impatience at what seemed like a mystery in him, so imperfectly as he was known to me then. Ishmael feels kind of a pull towards Ahab, like a magnetism, and we'll talk about that later too. But mostly he's curious about who this guy is, just like we're curious about who this guy is. And the bad news is we're not going to find out for a while, because even after we set sail, we're not going to be hanging out with Ahab for a bit. But we'll get there. Anyway, that's it for this time. That's it for those chapters. Next time, we're going to read chapters 17 and 18, the Ramadan and his mark. Thanks for hanging out. Thanks for watching. Until I see you again, please be good, be kind. Don't kick any puppies. Be sure to like, subscribe, leave comments, check out the Patreon. I'm so glad that you're here. I'm really enjoying reading Moby Dick with y'all. And stay tuned, because there's all kinds of other stuff coming. Also, if you're interested, I'm spinning up my other YouTube channel, Mike.Foster, to make some more non-Moby Dick content. So if you want to pop over there and get ahead of it with a subscribe, go right ahead. If you want to wait for some other content, do that too. But I'll link it in the description in case you're curious. Either way, thanks again for hanging out.